Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And given that we've just recently had the winner of the 2025 International Booker Prize, I thought it might be fun to look back 5 years and look at the 2020 shortlist. So I've just recently finished reading them and I'm really intrigued to talk a little bit about them. So let's get started going through them. So let's begin with the winner, and that is Lucas Rijneveld with The Discomfort of Evening, translated by Michele Hutchinson. And this was a controversial winner for several reasons. Firstly, the book is just, it's a very strong flavour, let's say. It is a book that talks about a family who grow up on a small Dutch dairy farm. And as part of that, we are mostly hearing from 10-year-old character Yaz, who is watching as several dramatic and tragic things happen in their family. And on the surface, that sounds like a fairly standard sort of set of fare for a story. But what I think is particularly strange about this one, and what put a lot of people off, kind of myself included here, was that it is incredibly full of bodily fluids and sex and violence and so many other things. And particularly because it's about a 10-year-old, we are also looking at a lot of things where the child is learning about sex, and there are some situations that feel quite murky in that sense of essentially, yeah, sort of sexualized ideas for this child involving other people, and it just becomes, it's a lot. Quite a lot of the time you're reading something that's otherwise fairly normal or standard, and then something big happens that is often about a body part of an animal or of a human. But in the background of all of this, there are parts where the main character is trying to deal with the loss of a family member, and all of these things come up. And it's this book that's deeply disturbing in several ways because of what is going on. This is an incredibly difficult situation for this young child who is growing up essentially in a very strict religious background as well. And that plays a big part in what feels like quite a claustrophobic narrative at times, because this child doesn't really have a bigger world outside of themselves and outside of the church and the farm and various other things around them to really understand other parts of themselves. It's a lot as a novel. It's one I struggled with, I have to admit. And actually, recently I read Rijneveld's most recent book, My Heavenly Favourite, which I enjoyed a lot more, even though that's also about incredibly difficult subject matter. That book's very Lolita-esque, if you catch my drift, with what is going on in that book. So Rijneveld clearly deals with some very tricky topics, but this book I think was one of those ones that very much split the room. And it's interesting looking at that with a lot of judges' decisions around prizes, because sometimes the prize will go to a very strong flavour, a book that may be quite polarising, but clearly as a result picks up people who really defend it to the hilt and love that book. Sometimes you get a book that's more of a maybe compromise winner, where there are a few strong flavours, but nobody can really agree on those strong flavours. And so everyone kind of opts for pizza or pasta or something safe in the middle that everyone likes, that is still a very good choice, but is maybe less sort of out there. And I think this is a classic case of a more out there book winning, even though I think quite a few books on this year's shortlist, on 2020's shortlist, were particularly out there in other ways as well. But this is, yeah, The Discomfort of Evening, which I struggle with. It wouldn't have been my personal favourite, but with 5 years of retrospect, I actually can kind of see how it happened, because I think it's a book that is so polarising that actually I think it would have had people really gunning for it to support it. Next up on the shortlist, we have The Enlightenment of the Greengage Tree by Shokoofeh Azar and translated by Adrien Kijek. And this is a really beautiful book, I think, in the way that it's told. So the book is mostly focused on a 13-year-old girl looking at Iran and the Islamic Revolution. But the storytelling aspect reminds me a lot of someone like Elif Shafak, with this really lyrical, beautiful style that feels like it belongs in that sense of almost like you're sat around a fire or sat at someone's feet hearing them tell you a story. It has that really beautiful lyrical style. And interesting that we have another book in this shortlist, and we'll see another one soon, with a fairly young protagonist in it. And this young child, I think, is such a fascinating one, because seeing something like the Islamic Revolution or these big political upheavals, I always find it really fascinating when you get a book that tells it from the a child's perspective, because often there are distinct elements that go over their head or they don't fully understand, but other things that they understand perhaps better than many of the adults around them. And this book, I think, is a really beautiful example of that, of watching as all of this book and the story unravels, and you've got this young girl at the heart of it. I thought this was so beautiful because she herself is this particularly defiant and interesting character in her own way. And so I think there's something about that I feel is really special, because she is interesting. This book is just told in this gorgeous lyrical style that makes it even more apparent that the harshness of what's going on around her is so harsh. You know, it creates this interesting juxtaposition of this beautiful lyrical tale and this young girl telling this story full of hope and optimism. And in the background, we know that things are going awry and that everyone's on tenterhooks for what's coming. So I thought this was so beautiful and such a nice addition to this list as well. Yeah, I really, really loved this. Next up, we have Gabriela, Cabezón, Cámara, I've probably butchered that name, with The Adventures of China Iron, translated by Fiona Mackintosh and Iona Macintyre. And I thought this book was so beautiful in a lot of ways as well. This really threw me because it's not what I expected it to be. I think given the title, it sounds like this is going to be a much more innocent book, because we're looking at adventures, and the book starts with this young girl, or fairly young woman, talking about her name, and nobody really seems to agree on a name for her. And so China Iron becomes the name. And it seems itself to also be a reference and a callback or a written response to a very popular tale in Argentina, where this book is set. And yet something really interesting is going on top of this as well. This is a book full of sex and violence and so many other things. And I found her a really fascinating protagonist, because she goes through the book trying to understand the world around her. And a big part of that is the wider political world as well. In many ways, there's a bit of overlap with the Enlightenment of the Greengage tree, but this is very, very different in several ways. One of which being that early conversations in this book seem to be about power and your social standing within that power. So she is looking at the fact that there is a British woman, and the British woman and her view of quote unquote savages in other parts of the world makes China Iron reflect on whether she would fall under that. She at one point is also, as she sees it, a slave to a black woman, and then she is really intrigued by what that means for power. There are so many other things that are going on in this book around Argentina and the UK and global colonialism and so many other things. But then you flip a couple of pages and she is having the most intense sex with somebody. And so there's something really intriguing about the way this book looks at this, and essentially uses sex and power and violence and various other things to tell a point about wider socio-political life. But also it's just really fun and interesting. There are so many bits of this I found quite funny, because she's quite innocent in some ways as a character, but then also very knowing and very sort of prepossessing in terms of how she sees herself. And so I just found this really utterly captivating, and I loved her as a character and what this book does. It's just so funny and raucous and outrageous, but also deeply felt and very thoughtful. I just really, really loved this. Next up, we have Tyll, or Tyll, I guess, as it probably would be actually, by Daniel Kehlmann, and translated by Ross Benjamin. And this I also really loved. I thought this was just such a wild romp in a way that doesn't sound like it would be particularly fascinating on the surface, or particularly wild, because essentially we are following this character who essentially is a kind of everyday fool who is enmeshed in various huge parts of history, particularly the 100 Years' War. in Europe. And so this is a book largely about European history, and particularly Western European history, but told through a character who seemingly just doesn't die for much of it and is able to escape death. And so sort of through him, we see the history of what's going on. We see him in battle. We see him talking to courtiers and other people in various positions of power. We see him with the everyday man. We see him trying to solve riddles and problems. We see him in all of these ways, but there's something so captivating about this, because essentially it's a fabulous kind of fairy tale book, but about European history in this, yeah, just very odd spanning way. And it feels, by doing that, by it being so fabulous in the kind of sense of creativity and wildness and creation and innovation almost, it feels like a book that is able to reshape or view European history through a specific lens of one that is chaotic and silly, but also has a real sense of order and reality to it. Tyll is this character who is essentially moving between all of these spaces and is essentially us in the narrative. We are viewing history through his eyes. We're able to be part of that because he's essentially the everyman who is there on the battlefield and there doing whatever. But equally, he is such an oddball character that we are able to laugh at him as essentially as a jester. He becomes almost like a fairy tale character himself, who is there to just be part of the story and be a recurring character almost in an arc of something else. So I really loved this. It's just a bit of a strange book, but I found myself really captivated by it in a way that I did not expect, because although I love myths and fairy tales and those sorts of stories, I couldn't quite see how it would mesh with a story like this that's about an historical event in Germany and wider sort of Western Europe at a time that I don't know a great deal about. But this was just a lot of fun and a very silly but very serious book at the same time. Next up, we have Fernanda Melchor with Hurricane Season, translated by Sophie Hughes. And this is, I mean, talk about wild. This is a very strong flavour shortlist, I think. And Hurricane Season is intense. So essentially the book starts with a series of bodies that seem to be washed up on shore, or particularly one body, and a discussion that starts within this Mexican town or village, I think it is, about witches. And essentially the witch, well, one of the witches in question is this figure who essentially is there as almost a curse on this village. She appears and is seen as a threat, but also an object of ridicule. And in the meantime, there are these huge discussions going on about violence and sex and gender, and particularly how especially sort of to some degree gender-based violence. There are these men who exist within this kind of machismo, and she, as this witch character, is there to essentially cut them down. So you've got these men who all think, well, I'm man enough to take on this witch, to either overpower her or to sleep with her or to do whatever. And she is in some ways this really difficult figure for those men to understand, because she is not stereotypically feminine. She's not clean in the same way that they would want. She's dangerous, she's powerful. And so in some ways she is also a stand-in to some degree for a wider discussion about gender-based violence. But there is something fascinating going on, because this witch speaks in this narrative in a way that is insulting these men's manhood. She often throws out slurs, sometimes quite homophobic ones, at these men to ridicule their lack of potency against her. But the book is also told in this deeply suffocating and overwhelming style. There are no real paragraph breaks. This is a block of text told at breathtaking speed that just is unrelenting and aggressive and in your face. And I loved that aspect of it. I actually genuinely felt exhausted after reading this book. I would read it in shorter bursts and then go and lie down and look at the ceiling, because it's so intense. It's told with this relentless ongoing style that just punches and punches, and you get these beautiful, glorious sentences, and then this violence and this horror and so many other things going on. It's such a strong flavour of a book. I really greatly enjoyed it for the most part. I know this one also polarised people. And it's kind of like nothing else really I've read in that sense. It's just this splurge of words onto a page that is somehow really intensely and beautifully crafted. I thought this was so interesting, but no, I know that people hated this when the shortlist came out. It was a tough one. I didn't quite give it 5 stars at the time, but I did really enjoy what was going on with it as well. So yeah, it's a lot, this book, and I see why it was distinctive enough to also break through the other 100 or so books that the judges would have been reading. And last but not least, we have Yoko Ogawa with The Memory Police, which was translated by Stephen Snyder. And this book is an interesting one for this list as well, because imagine as well, this is quite early into the International Booker and its history. This was one of the sort of, I think maybe the fifth year maybe, of the newer style, where it was an individual book rather than the author. And this is a book that was translated from a book that was about 20 years old. So in some ways, this was quite an interesting first example of something like that happening here, where an older book was revivified by a translation, and so we are looking at the book that is from a different time. And in some ways that is interesting given what goes on in this book, because to some degree it has quite a futuristic sense of what it's looking at. The idea being that words can be taken from people, memories can be eclipsed and can be made to disappear at any moment. And so we have a character who is slowly watching the world around her be taken from her. There are phrases or words that might suddenly disappear. A certain book will be made to disappear, and with it, any words that were in that book and relatively unique to that book might also disappear with it. And this starts to mean that even flavours start to become a difficult thing, because somebody might say, oh, do you have some of that, whatchamacallit? Because the word has started to disappear. And at one point she's watching somebody who's selling celery and thinking about what that might be, and how, there's a strong sense of how language interacts with it, with the world we live in a sort of 1984-esque way, but I think in a way that's also interesting in a different sense. So in looking at this totalitarian state, or this overpowering state, it actually does something quite interesting, I think, even given that this was written so much earlier, because it feels like it has almost a tech quality to it, where the idea being that something could be digital, and then because it's digital, it can be very easily removed forever. Whereas a physical object, you would have to do a fair bit of destruction to make sure that every single one of those things disappeared in the world, or all photos disappeared, or whatever. And so we slowly watch as this character tries to maintain a sense of the world around her by, for example, writing a novel. And that's one thing that she does, which gives this book an extra added layer of something kind of almost meta, because she is writing a novel, as is Yoko Ogawa, sorry. And so we're watching her disappear, trying to write herself, and that itself is being written and is a thing that is testament to that memory. So I thought this book was really interesting in some ways. I did sort of lose a bit of a sense of joy towards the end of it. It's quite a lot, but actually at the same time, I think the book had something really intelligent to say, and particularly this idea of memory and what have you. And this is in some ways, again, a very different book for the rest of the shortlist, a book that is full of a lot of violence and sex and this intensity. And this is a slightly quieter novel that in many ways deals with disappearance more than it deals with anything else, even though the memory police in the States are themselves violent in a different sort of lateral sense. So yeah, I found this book really interesting alongside everything else, especially for how different it is. And so those are the shortlisted books. And I think, I think it's probably clear from how I've spoken about these that I have personal favourites within them. but it's such an odd shortlist. I think a really good one, don't get me wrong. I think these are brilliant books. But just, you've got quite a lot of young children or youngish people writing about their life with this sense of innocence in these stories. And that connective tissue of these books is very interesting. But then you've got these outliers that are something else entirely. So Tyll or Tyll, I'm still not quite sure how to pronounce it, is just so wild and deals with sweeping history in this completely different way to these other books that in many ways are dealing with individual microcosms of history, or in the case of Greengage Tree, dealing with a whole revolution but told through the eyes of one person. And so this book is these sets of books are just so wild and interesting. I think my personal favourites are probably I think either The Adventures of China Iron or Hurricane Season. I think both of which are a lot of fun. I think Tyll or Tyll is so good too. I really loved what this book did. I was not expecting it to like it half as much as I did. And as I've mentioned, The Discomfort of Evening, it was a book that I struggled with. I do sometimes wonder if I reread it now whether I'd like it more, because I think I read it closer to the time of the shortlist and really struggled with it. But having enjoyed my heavenly favourite despite the difficult subject matter, I wonder if now going back I would find this less gross or whatever. And I normally have a good threshold for gross stuff, so it surprises me that I didn't like it as much. But either way, I think this is one of those shortlists that really reminds you of just how exciting it is to have translated fiction, because we have 6 books from entirely different writing cultures, from various parts of the world, telling stories in radically different ways. And all of them, despite converging on some key points, also tell stories in such unique and varied and interesting ways. So even though it wasn't the winner I would have personally chosen, I still think I get why, particularly in a shortlist that has so many strong flavours already. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Any books you really love from this shortlist. Speak to you all soon and take care. Bye-bye.